Well, good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to our little conversation this morning about marine insurance. Insurance for cruising boats. Dave, can you just introduce yourself and tell us what your role is at Admiral?
Yeah, good morning. My name's Dave Andrew. I'm the underwriter at Admiral Marine. I've been here for 17 years, and basically being the underwriter means that I liaise direct with our customers and set our premium and terms.
And Richard, what's your role at Admiral?
My role at Admiral, I'm Richard Chitty. My role at Admiral is looking after the claims. So I hope I don't have to speak to you, but if I do, I'll try and make your experience as palatable and as easy as possible to get you back on the water and sailing again.
So as part of our conversation this morning, we're hoping to lift the veil on what it is that's included in an insurance policy. What is it you're actually buying? I mean, that's really my first question for you, Dave, is when somebody buys an insurance policy, what are they getting?
Well, what they're buying is something that they hope they will never need to use. But what they are buying is peace of mind that if something goes wrong, they have recourse to an insurance policy to put it right. And those are things like accidental damage to the boat, losing your tender or your outboard motor, personal property associated with the boat, and of course, your liabilities to third parties.
Are there any areas that are not included typically in a marine insurance policy that sometimes surprises people that isn't there? What might they expect is there but is not normally included?
Well, most marine policies will include a small amount of personal accident and medical expenses cover, but that shouldn't be confused with the sort of cover that you would get from a specialist travel insurance provider.
So really, we're talking about the boat and the equipment on the boat and your liability for operating the boat.
Exactly. It's the boat and your liabilities arising from it. Yeah.
And it's not an exact science, I know, but what are the kind of things that you're considering when you're coming up with a premium? Because a premium is the amount of money someone pays, and that's effectively the measure of the risk, isn't it?
That's exactly right. There are all sorts of factors that I will take into account, not least of which the value, the age, and the size of the boat.
So why would the things like the age and the value of the boat make a difference?
The value of the boat, we actually apply a rate per cent to the total value, so that's absolutely key. The age of the boat will, to an extent, determine value, and an older boat you may find will have a lower value, but premium will be proportionately higher because a partial loss claim, repairs to damage, for example, will cost the same no matter how old the boat.
So the premium is really looking at the likely cost of putting that damage right, rather than necessarily what your boat is worth.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. We also take that value and risk into account by applying excess. Some people might be more familiar with the term deductible. That's the amount of any claim for which the insured is responsible. Usually we would apply a percentage of boat value. The excess is dependent on geographical location, and it may be possible to reduce premium if you volunteer to increase the amount of excess that the insurer first comes up with.
You mentioned geographic area. Why does the area make a difference to the premium?
The area is significant because in our experience, cost of claims is so much greater the further away from European waters you move. That's particularly true when you are Bluewater cruising. You are probably far less likely to have an incident crossing the Atlantic or crossing the Pacific than you are day sailing in the Solent. But you're a long way from help. You're a long way from home, and any repairs could be significant cost-wise.
So again, it's not the likelihood of that situation occurring; it's the cost of rectifying the situation should it occur, and that's what you're measuring.
That's exactly right, and that's also true, for example, in the Caribbean, where cruising is absolutely wonderful, but the Caribbean way of life is one of those tomorrow never comes sort of situations. And unless you are actually there in the Caribbean supervising the yards to get repairs done, it can take forever to get a fairly simple repair carried out. And all the time, particularly if the boat is ashore, your insurer is incurring storage charges.
That's an interesting point. If I was to have an accident whilst cruising, my insurance policy is going to cover the cost of getting my boat back to where the situation it was beforehand, less my deductible, but it's not going to reimburse me for the cost necessarily of moving into a hotel, is it?
No, it's not. Not to a significant degree. The Admiral policy offers a limited amount of accommodation cover if the boat is uninhabitable. But really, that sort of thing is a consequential loss that a marine insurance policy isn't intended to provide.
And are there any other things that Bluewater insurance is different from the kind of insurance people would normally be buying if they're just sailing maybe in UK waters or European waters?
Well, amongst the things that you need to take into account, and again, that I take into account when I'm assessing the risk, is the number, age and experience of the crew on board. We're quite comfortable usually insuring double-handed crew, but it's depressing when you talk to an insurance person because we'll only ever tell you about the bad things. We never hear about all the good things that go on. And some of the bad things that go on, for example, catastrophic electrical failure with when all you've got is an auto helm. You're in the middle of the Atlantic or in the middle of the Pacific and it's just two of you on board. That's an awful long way to have to hand steer. And that's when accidents happen. That's when insurance claims can happen. So there's a lot of assessment goes on before we come up with, before I'll set a premium and terms for any given risk.
So in the case of double handers, might you consider the equipment they've got on board the boat as part of that interview process?
Certainly. I mean, one of my automatic questions to double handers is what methods of self-steering do you have? And if the answer comes back that they have a wind vane, that is in essence a third crew member, particularly useful when it doesn't talk back and doesn't eat.
And uses no power, of course.
And uses no power.
I know some cruisers on catamarans and bigger boats also do fit a second autopilot. So they effectively have redundancy for their system, which is another consideration.
If there is sufficient redundancy built in, again, questions we ask and answers that will take on their own merit each time.
Does it make a difference whether boats are crossing oceans or just cruising in interesting areas?
Interesting areas such as French Polynesia, for example, they are still to the insurance market regarded as blue water, so they are still expensive places. If you're looking, for example, at taking time out in Australia or New Zealand, breaking up a world arc circumnavigation, then premiums will come down for the time you're in those first world countries.
So it's not a fixed activity, really. As the boat moves, then are you suggesting that the client should keep in contact with the broker and stay engaged with their cruising progress?
Certainly, it always helps to keep lines of communication open. We work on the basis of understanding a person's itinerary for a given policy year and will set a premium according to that. If it changes, if the plans change, then so can the policy and the premium could go up or down. My recommendation would always be only to buy an insurance for an area that you know you are going to need. If there is any doubt as to your future plans, discuss them, but don't buy the cover for them until you know they're going to happen.
So it's possible once you've started a policy to add on a geographic region if you then decide you're going to go maybe to the Mediterranean, for example. You can top up in that sense. It's
far easier to add than it is to take away. But adding is certainly not a problem. One thing that you should look out for with any insurer is what they might charge on top of their premium. Do they, for example, charge mid-term fees for any policy amendment. Admiral doesn't, but I do know that there are companies out there who do.
That's a useful question to ask when buying a policy, is if I change it, am I going to get charged for the privilege of changing it?
Exactly.
What about if I go out and buy maybe a new dinghy and outboard? Will that change my insurance?
Fractionally, we specify the make, model and value of a dinghy and an outboard motor. So if you replace some old kit with new, it's always worth letting your insurance company know. If it doesn't make a tremendous difference to the value under the policy, then there's probably going to be no charge. But always let your insurers know about changes of that nature.
What about when I leave my lovely cruising boat in a beautiful part of the world, so let's say the Caribbean, for example? Do I need to tell my insurer that I'm leaving it there?
You don't necessarily need to tell your insurer if you are leaving a boat there for any length of time, but different insurers will have different requirements for what you must do to look after the boat whilst you're away. Most policies will say that a boat needs to be left in a safe and suitable place when it's not underway. That's a little bit woolly, so we add to that if you are leaving a boat for more than 30 days, you actually need to make sure you've got somebody contracted to keep an eye on it. In the Caribbean, for example, if you're leaving her afloat, make sure that the lines are secure, make sure that she's aired. That's equally true of boats ashore. Definitely worth having somebody go on board once every couple of weeks, once every 3 weeks, just to check everything is in order. We had a horrible story of a client who left his boat ashore somewhere in the Caribbean, flew back home for 6 months, returned to the boat where nobody had been looking at it throughout the period, and found that all of the interior joinery had turned to sawdust. He'd been infected by termites.
Oh dear.
And that's not an insured peril.
So what would be the risks that were covered if I was to leave my boat in a boatyard in the Caribbean?
There are 2 stages to that. One is leaving a boat. Let's put the hurricane risk aside for one moment and just talk about general risks. There is a risk of toppling, which is covered. There is lightning damage is possible. Fire is always a possibility. So you are still insuring what is a considerable investment for you whilst she is sitting going nowhere.
So what about hurricane insurance for the Caribbean?
It's now virtually impossible to obtain that cover as standard from any insurer in the UK. 1 or 2 will offer it as an extension, but that cover is going to be prohibitively expensive and it will carry some fairly onerous terms along with it.
So basically it's possible but quite difficult. So if most people don't have hurricane insurance or named storm cover, what would you advise a client looking to keep their boat in the Caribbean for the summer season?
To research where they want to keep their boat during the hurricane season to minimise the risk to themselves.
And are there some locations that are better than others?
We know a number of locations. Certainly I would look in the southern Caribbean, Grenada, Carriacou, Trinidad to an extent, moving further west, the ABC Islands. And of course, if people's long-term plans are perhaps to head even further west through the Panama Canal, then there are some good yards in Colombia and good facilities in Panama.
So in summary, you would say to people, plan ahead, plan where you're going to lay up and talk to your broker.
Exactly, and certainly we have plenty of experience of facilities throughout the Caribbean, and we'd be more than happy to share that knowledge with individuals.
Any advice about how you lay the boat up in the Caribbean in the summer?
The best way of laying up ashore is to put the boat in a cradle and make sure that she's tied down to ground anchor points. You need to remove any loose items. Any sails apart from main sails furled in mast or in boom need to come off and be stored below. And as I mentioned, get a guardianage contract to keep an eye on her for the non-hurricane problems.
So making sure your batteries are topped up and someone's checking on the boat.
Yep.
Of course, in the Caribbean, keeping it aired is important as well. So
very
a good boatyard should be able to offer these kind of gardenage services, shouldn't they?
A good boatyard will, or there are specialist gardiennage services. Again, we know some in various locations throughout the Caribbean.
Any other specific points a cruiser should be looking for in good blue water insurance?
An insurer who understands what that cruiser wants and what that cruiser is trying to achieve. And an insurer who is able to communicate with you virtually 24/7 and via whatever means is most suitable for you given your circumstances.
So in particular, you're going to be dealing with flaky email connections and wobbly satellite links, aren't you?
Exactly. So understanding that if somebody's got a flaky satellite connection, don't try sending a large photo to them. Just simple things that make all the difference.
Another option for keeping your boat on the other side of the Atlantic for Europeans is to go up to United States and Canada. Is that something that an Admiral policy would cover?
Yeah, if that's within somebody's requirements, we can certainly accommodate that. Again, the issue is hurricane cover. We would suggest storing above Cape Hatteras to keep well out of the way of the hurricane area on the east coast of the US.
So are there any other blue water exceptions a cruiser should be aware of? Perhaps, for example, going into Australia or New Zealand?
Australia is an excellent example. Beautiful cruising grounds and nothing particularly untoward in terms of insurance coverage, except that authorities and mariners there are looking for a minimum third-party liability cover of up to 10 million Australian dollars. So make sure your insurer can provide that cover. We're even seeing that to an extent now in New Zealand with 10 million New Zealand dollars being required by some mariners.
So again, it's a good reason to keep in regular contact with your broker as your plans change.
Very much so. And the other thing it's worth doing if you are thinking about going blue water is to establish a relationship with an insurance company sooner rather than later. Even if you're going to spend a year or two in home waters before you set off, establish the relationship in advance. Again, it helps everybody.
Do you insist on specific qualifications from a boat owner, or how are you measuring their experience?
Some do, but we are far more interested in practical experience than formal qualifications. Qualifications help to back up experience, but it is experience that counts to us.
And would that be certified logbooks? How are you measuring the competence of a prospective insurance risk?
Insurance has always been based on a principle of what we call utmost good faith. And it is simply trusting that the word of your proposer, that the information they are giving you is correct. We have the option to seek clarity if we want to.
And that's a good point to make, isn't it? That if false information is provided, it would invalidate an insurance policy.
Very much so, yes.
So trust on both sides as well.
Always tell the truth. Don't think that truth hurts. Don't think that any insurer is trying to catch you out. We're just trying to understand the risk and provide a policy that will cover you if anything goes wrong.
Are there any other particular points of blue water insurance that cruisers should understand in their policy? Maybe unusual wording or things that they wouldn't have found in a regular, what I call weekend sailors policy?
There's nothing that springs readily to mind. One thing that does occur to me, though, is single-handing. You probably find most policies will limit the extent of single-handed sailing. We typically will offer no more than 250 nautical miles per uninterrupted passage. For some people, that if they are looking at single-handing long distances, that's not going to be sufficient. And they do need to make very, very clear to the insurer from the outset if they are intending to single hand for long periods.
But certainly if I want to move my boat on my own from the anchorage round into my boatyard berth, for example, that's single-handed. That's going to be covered.
It's single-handing. That's absolutely fine if you're not actually putting to sea. If you're just motoring within the confines of a port or a harbour or whatever, that's accepted practice.